You spend the first 6 years of your career as the guy nobody particularly wants sitting next to them at lunch. The warehouse systems specialist at a mid-size industrial parts distributor in Terute, Indiana. The precise reason people avoid you is that you're the only person under 40 who can still make sense of the inventory code the company has been running since 1991. A Cobalt-based mainframe system called StockPoint, written by a contractor who passed away in 2003 and left behind a single 340-page manual, half of it water-damaged inside a filing cabinet nobody bothered to protect. Your manager, a worn-down man named Ron Aldean, originally brought you on to handle barcode scanner support, and it's purely by accident, 6 weeks into the job, that he learns you spent an entire weekend teaching yourself RPG and Cobalt syntax using a stack of used textbooks, all because the StockPoint terminal kept crashing and no one else would go near it. Ron doesn't really thank you for it. He simply stops sending you scanner tickets and starts forwarding every StockPoint error email your way instead. That's how, without any real announcement, you become the sole person in a 60,000 square foot warehouse who actually understands the system, tracking everything the company owns. The person who genuinely taught you in the way that truly counts was never a manager at all, but a semi-retired contractor named Walter Noak, brought in by Ron for 2 afternoons a month back when the maintenance budget still permitted it, before accounting quietly eliminated that line item in 2018 and left the system's survival to whoever was curious enough to keep it running. Walter is 68 the first time you two meet, wearing the same gray cardigan on every visit, and he talks about the StockPoint codebase the way certain men talk about a car they rebuilt from scratch, with a level of detail that borders on affection, pointing out which subroutines were rushed under deadline pressure and which ones the original programmer clearly took his time perfecting. Almost as an afterthought, during your third afternoon together, he shows you a printed stack of green bar paper listing every date handling routine in the system, telling you half-jokingly that whoever eventually inherits this whole mess should photograph it before it falls apart completely, since nobody still alive remembers where most of the logic actually lives. That night, you photograph all 40 pages on your phone, mostly out of politeness. Without either of you realizing it at the time, it becomes the single most valuable document you'll possess for the next decade. For 4 years, this remains a hobby rather than a career. You fix a batch job that had been silently double-counting pallets since 2016. You rewrite a report that used to take 11 hours to run so that it now takes 40 minutes. None of this registers with anyone outside the building, because nobody outside the building has any reason to think about 3-decade-old inventory software. Everything shifts on a Thursday in February when a woman named Denise Okafor calls the warehouse's main line asking, in her words, for anyone who still understands StockPoint, and after being transferred 4 times, she lands on your desk phone. Denise runs a 2-person consulting operation out of Columbus that exclusively brokers emergency legacy systems assistance to companies that got burned, usually discovering during an audit or an acquisition that the software running their entire supply chain hasn't had a qualified maintainer in years. She explains that a fastener manufacturer called Continental Bracket Corp, based in Michigan, is 3 weeks away from a compliance deadline, and their StockPoint installation, the actual backbone of their $340 million a year operation, has started silently corrupting shipment records, while the 2 contractors who used to maintain it are both dead. One from a heart attack in 2019, the other from a stroke the previous spring. You take Continental Bracket's situation seriously enough to spend a Saturday reading through the corrupted logs Denise emails over, and you locate the bug within about 3 hours, a date rollover error nobody ever patched, because the original programmer reasonably assumed back in 1991 that the company would have replaced the system by the year 2000. You fix it remotely, unpaid, mostly out of sheer curiosity, and mention offhand to Denise that you'd be open to doing this kind of work properly if the need ever arose again. 9 days later, Denise calls back to say Continental Bracket wants to pay you $4,200 for a single afternoon of work, along with a signed retainer of $1,800 a month, simply to remain reachable if anything breaks down again. You nearly laugh at the figure. Ron doesn't laugh when you tell him. Neither does Continental Bracket's blunt plant manager, Kessler Denore, who tells you flatly over the phone that his company would rather pay you $1,800 a month indefinitely than spend an estimated $6.1 million over 14 months migrating 34-year-old inventory logic onto a modern system that nobody currently on staff understands well enough to even scope out. Word travels through this particular tiny world exactly the way it moves through every insular industry. Not through advertising, since there's essentially no advertising for what you do, but through a handful of consultants like Denise who all know each other, and a handful of plant managers and CFOs who inevitably discover, usually in a panic, that their company's entire operational memory is written in a dead language only a few dozen living people can still read. By the following autumn, you've picked up 2 more retainers, a beverage distributor in Ohio and a hardware wholesaler in Pennsylvania, both running StockPoint variants licensed from the same now-defunct 1990s vendor, both paying you between $1,600 and $2,400 a month just to exist as a phone number they can reach, plus separate hourly billing at $340 an hour whenever something genuinely breaks. One night at your kitchen table, working the numbers on a legal pad the way you've always done when something feels too good to fully trust, you realize these 3 retainers alone, while you'd be requiring almost no active work most months, already exceed your full-time warehouse salary. You give Ron 6 weeks' notice, more than he even asked for, since he's the reason you ever touched StockPoint in the first place. Without much visible emotion, he tells you he always figured you'd end up somewhere paying you what you were actually worth. He just didn't expect it to happen this specifically or this quickly. That winter, you incorporate as a one-person LLC, no employees, no office, just a name, Legacy Stock Solutions, and a phone number that used to be your warehouse extension and now follows you everywhere. The work itself is almost aggressively unglamorous. You spend entire days combing through fixed-width text files that look like a solid wall of numbers to anyone else, tracing a single miscounted SKU through 11 different subroutines written by a man who's been dead for 2 decades. And that tedium is exactly what protects your position. The pool of people willing to do this kind of work has been shrinking every year since the COBOL programming boom of the 70s and 80s produced its final graduating class, with universities dropping the subject entirely somewhere around 2005. By your own rough estimate, using a directory Denise helped you put together, you're one of perhaps 60 people nationwide who can competently read and modify this specific StockPoint dialect, still running inside an estimated 400 mid-size manufacturers, distributors, and regional retailers, most of whom have no public awareness that this risk even exists inside their operation, until the day it stops being theoretical. The real turning point arrives 18 months in on a Tuesday afternoon in March, when your phone rings with an unfamiliar number, and the voice on the other end belongs to a woman named Margaret Finn, Chief Operating Officer of a private conglomerate called Harabel Industries, which owns, among other holdings, 11 regional food distribution warehouses, all running a heavily modified StockPoint installation that nobody at the company fully understands anymore, since the last person who did retired to Florida in 2021 and stopped responding to emails. Harabel is ultimately owned by a reclusive holding company billionaire named Preston Vance III, a man you will never actually meet. And Marguerite tells you, with the particular flatness of someone reciting a figure she still finds slightly absurd, that the board has approved a monthly retainer of $22,000, plus a $600 an hour emergency rate for someone who can guarantee they'll answer within 4 hours of any inventory system failure across all 11 warehouses. When you carefully ask why the number is that high, she gives you the honest answer that Harabel calculated what a single 48-hour outage across their perishable goods supply chain would cost in spoiled plant, inventory, and lost retail contracts, somewhere north of $9 million, making $22,000 a month to prevent even a fraction of that risk, not a luxury expense, but the cheapest insurance policy the company has ever bought. You don't push for a higher number right away, even though you could, because by then you've learned, mostly from Denise, that real money in this particular niche isn't built by squeezing a single client. It's built by becoming so reliably steady during a crisis that the client can't picture operating without you, and reputation inside a 60-person industry spreads faster and wider than any invoice ever could. Before that crisis, though, the Harabel relationship nearly collapses within its first month over something that has nothing to do with your competence and everything to do with a company culture still adjusting to needing you. A junior operations analyst named Beckett Puit, 26 years old and 2 years removed from a supply chain management program, decides during your third week on retainer that paying an outside contractor $22,000 a month to babysit software is an embarrassment to the department, and quietly tries to reroute a batch job failure to Harabel's internal help desk instead of calling you, apparently hoping to prove the retainer unnecessary. The internal help desk spends 6 hours failing to diagnose the problem before Margaret, Checking in out of habit, discovers the ticket was never escalated to you at all, with the shipment window now 4 hours from closing. You get the actual call at 1 in the morning instead of 7 the previous evening, diagnose the failure in 50 minutes once you finally have the logs in hand, and never mention Beckett's name to anyone, though Marguerite brings it up unprompted a week later, letting you know Beckett has been quietly reassigned to a regional office in Toledo. You don't feel any particular triumph about it, just noting, the way you've noted most things since Walter's green bar printout, that tedious, unglamorous work is always safest when nobody smart enough to feel threatened by it is standing too close. 6 months into the Harabel retainer, at 11:40 on a Sunday night, you get the call that actually puts everything to the test. A batch process across 4 of Harabel's warehouses has failed silently for 9 hours straight, meaning every shipment manifest generated since Saturday morning could be wrong, and Monday morning trucks carrying refrigerated inventory to grocery chains across 3 states are scheduled to leave at 5 a.m., regardless of whether the data checks out. You're at your kitchen table by midnight, the same table where you once ran the numbers that convinced you to leave the warehouse job, and you spend 4 hours tracing the failure back to a memory allocation error triggered by a routine software update. Harabel's outsourced IT vendor pushed, without realizing it would clash with 34-year-old code nobody there had reviewed in over a decade. You fix it at 3:52 a.m., confirm the manifests are clean by 4:30, and the trucks leave right on schedule. Marguerite calls the following Wednesday, not exactly to thank you, in the same understated way Ron never quite managed either, but to let you know the board reviewed the incident and voted to extend your retainer into a 3-year contract with an automatic renewal clause and a built-in 6% annual increase. Because, as she puts it, the alternative, discovering during some future crisis that you'd taken a better offer elsewhere, was a risk the board found far more unsettling than the retainer itself. By your 3rd year running Legacy Stock Solutions, you're holding 7 active retainers ranging from $1,600 to $22,000 a month, totaling roughly $61,000 in guaranteed monthly income before a single emergency hour gets billed. You've also started doing something Denise suggested a year earlier, almost as a joke, training 2 other people, a laid-off mainframe operator named Colton Reyes, and a woman named Elsa Brandt who used to work on payroll systems back in the 1990s. Teaching them enough of the stock point dialect that you can now sell overflow capacity instead of turning clients away. Taking a management cut instead of personally handling every emergency call at 3 in the morning. By your 4th year, Colton and Elsa are handling nearly half of your incoming emergency calls without your involvement, freeing you up to take on a type of work you never anticipated back when you first taught yourself Cobalt out of boredom in a break room. Advisory retainers where companies pay you not to fix stock point, but simply to sit in the room during acquisition due diligence and tell them honestly whether the legacy system they're about to inherit is a manageable risk or a hidden liability significant enough to renegotiate the purchase price over. You end up doing exactly this for a private equity firm evaluating Continental Bracket Corp itself, the very same fastener manufacturer that first hired you through Denise's referral, and you tell the firm's soft-spoken lead partner, Osgood Bramwell, that the system is stable but entirely dependent on one person, you, and that any acquisition agreement should include a transition clause guaranteeing your services for at least 24 months after closing. Bramwell's firm writes that clause into the deal without any pushback, because by then your name carries more weight in that particular room than most software vendors twice your size. The following spring, you run into Ron at a regional logistics conference, the kind of event you never would have been invited to as a warehouse employee, and now get invited to as a keynote panelist on legacy systems risk. And he asks, with what sounds like genuine curiosity rather than any lingering resentment, what you think the actual lesson is, since half the room seems convinced you simply got lucky, stumbling into a niche nobody else wanted. You tell him the truth, which is almost embarrassingly simple, that every company in that room is sitting on some piece of infrastructure so old and so tedious that its own employees have spent years quietly hoping it never breaks on their watch. And that for 30 years, almost nobody thought it was worth their time to actually learn the one thing everyone else kept avoiding. Ron nods slowly, the way people do when an answer feels too simple to fully accept, and says he always assumed the real money was in the newest technology, not the oldest. You don't bother correcting him because there's no version of that conversation that ends with him fully understanding, since the real lesson was never actually about mainframes or COBOL at all. You still keep your phone charged to exactly 100% every single night before bed, a habit that started at that kitchen table years ago and never left you. Because somewhere across 11 warehouses and 7 client companies, a piece of code older than most of your client's employees is quietly keeping an entire supply chain alive. And the only thing standing between that and a multi-million-dollar failure is whether you pick up the phone. Most nights, nobody calls at all. And most nights, that silence is the entire business model working exactly the way it's supposed to.